Hi, I'm Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and you're either watching or listening to No BS Coaching Advice, either as a video or as the No BS Coaching Advice podcast. I originally met Jennifer Peatman as part of the Forbes Coaches Council. I was smitten with her knowledge. Great background, interesting show. I'm sure you'll find helpful. And I also want to mention at the end of the show, there's information about how you can reach her or reach me for further assistance. So hang in there, watch or listen to the show. It is terrific. And with that, let's get going. So my guest today is Jennifer Peatman, who spent the last 17 years coaching executives in building and designing HR organizations from the ground up. Like me, she's a Forbes contributor and Forbes Coaches Council member. Basically, she's an executive-level advisor and coach to business leaders on HR issues, seeking strategies and solutions for large organizations in diverse, geographically dispersed, I should say, and multicultural global environments, and also working with startups as well. And has a load of certifications, is a great person for us to be having this conversation with. Jennifer, hi, welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction.
You're welcome. And folks, we're going to be talking today about creating a corporate culture in your organization and starting, from the early stages of your firm. I'm sure there's going to be material that'll apply for larger institutions as well. So why start out building that culture in the early days, and how early should you be starting?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So what I would say is immediately. And the reason that you want to start thinking about it so early is because culture is one of those very intangible things that you really only are aware of once it becomes a problem. And once it does become a problem, it's so far down the road that it's very hard to pull back and change. So if you can incorporate being thoughtful about it into the very, very beginning stages of your company, I promise you, you will save yourself a lot of heartache down the road.
And how early?
Well, I think that as soon as a founder has an idea of what kind of a company, so they need to have a product, they need to have a target audience, and then I think they want to start thinking about what kind of employees are they looking to hire? What kind of behaviors do they value? What kind of behaviors do they want to stay away from? Employees define a company, and there's a reason we call them human resources, because they literally are.
I'm sorry for laughing, but
yeah, it's a definition. And so I think that we want to start, and also in this job market, it is tough to find good employees. And so you really want to start thinking about what kind of employees you want to attract and what kind of people you want to build your company on.
And when I think of the founders that I've worked with in my career, often their first reaction is, we want the people with skill.
Right.
And that's all. That's as far as they go. It's relatively linear. Square peg, square hole can do the job.
That's right. And I've spent the last probably 10 years in technology. And as you can imagine, engineers do have a focus specifically on technical skills, as an example, or certifications, or, different programming languages, right? Mm-hmm. My job has been to convince them that in addition to those skills, there are a lot of other things that are important as well.
Of course. And I'm always curious. I want folks to start by saying, if you've watched me for any length of time, you know that I have an issue around the notion of hiring for fit. Because I think in the environments that are set up on interviews, job hunters are on good behavior. So would founders be. And how do you evaluate for fit when both sides are, I'll politely say, not being fully honest with one another?
Mm-hmm.
It's evaluating for the act.
Yeah. So, I think the question that you're asking, though, I think we need to ask the question before that, which is we need to identify what I agree with you about hiring for fit, but what we need to agree on as founders, or as a C-suite or as an executive team, is what do we want for this company?
And in looking for what we want, that's not just simply we want to make a lot of money, take it public, or sell it out to the firm that offers us the most amount of money. It's the environment.
Well, that might be part of it. And I actually think that's a big part of it is, yes, what do we want to sell it for? What do we want to build? Who are our customers going to be? But what's really, I think important is we need a team that's going to be able to get us there, right? So we want a team that works well together, that's efficient, that's productive, and those kinds of things. So when we talk about culture, a lot of times we over-rotate on these notions of we want people to be happy, we want people to feel loved and special and all of that. And I actually believe in those things. But the other piece of culture is those things that you're talking about, right? Like we want a culture of, productive, high, efficiently trained employees that are all focused in the same direction.
I'm an MSW from Fordham, by the way, so I tend to think in the holistic manner. But I'm curious, when you're working with founding teams that are starting to think in terms of, okay, we have to start bringing people on board, what do you encourage them to ask one another? Because I'm going to work with the assumption that there are co-founders in this.
Yes. So the biggest area where I see founders fall down or early level executive teams is that what they do is they get together and they get a big whiteboard and they say, what do we want our values to be? What do we want to build our culture on? And I always think that's a really bad idea. And here's why. What I encourage people to do is observe, don't decide. So what I mean by that is instead of thinking cerebrally about what kind of a culture we'd like to build, I actually want you to look to the founders of the organizations and observe their values, observe their behaviors, observe the way that they work. Because what I often see is that, once a company gets to a certain level and they start to bring in a middle leadership and, maybe now they've hired a head of HR and maybe they've hired some recruiters and those kinds of things, those people start to say, we want to build our culture and we want to define our values. But the problem is there's often a disconnect between the founders and the middle level of the organization. So then what we've got is a culture that's actually built on what we think and not what we do.
And it's funny how often there's a disconnect between thinking and doing. And to me, from my background, because I'm also psychoanalytically trained as well, I always look at the behaviors first because everyone knows the right thing to say.
Right.
We've all been infiltrated with, corrective values that we don't follow.
Right.
So observing the behavior, do you try to bring in someone from the outside to observe, or do you just, as a team, notice what each of you does and don't do?
Well, I'm a big fan of there being someone or some entity that owns the people function. Now, early on in a startup environment, depending on your funding and depending on your round of funding, there may or may not be budget for somebody who's actually, a CHRO kind of a person. But somebody needs to have their eye on the ball. And more importantly, it does need to be somebody that understands sort of how this works. And there's somewhat of a specialist or have done something like this previously.
Mm-hmm. And thus, basically, they're walking around taking notes about what each person's doing. It almost reminds me of olden days where they used to be the efficiency expert that would walk around with the clipboards taking notes.
Maybe, yeah. And what I'm more talking about is actually observing the leadership of the company and the way that team operates and the way that team communicates and behaves. So, for example, this is one of my favorite examples. The middle level management of the organization will say, we value transparency, we value communication, we value empowering people. But then when I look to the founders or the C-suite or the executive team, what I realize is that the founders maybe, for example, over-rotate on privacy, over-rotate on not actually, holding things close to the chest. Mm-hmm. So then it becomes conflict between those two things, for example, right? So the founders might be great at some things, which of course they are, right? They're the founders for a reason. But let's highlight and value those things, because then the whole organization, as goes the leadership, so does the rest of the organization.
You bet. Behaviorally, people will follow what they notice. It's kind of like children with parents. In that, parents will say certain things, and there's a disconnect between what they encourage people to do and what they themselves do.
That's right.
It doesn't surprise me that there's often a disconnect between what the founders say and what middle management comes in.
That's right.
Because it hasn't been communicated to them. and they
That's
haven't
right.
lived through it.
Absolutely.
So now that we're at the point where we're starting to observe values through behavior, how do you codify that into something that allows someone to create the environment? How do you take it from concept to delivery, let's say?
Right. So I think that if you have somebody in the mix who has observed the behavior and maybe led some conversations with the executive team about these are some of the things that I think that our organization values and I think are part of the fabric of the organization, I think that there needs to be buy-in from the executive team, whoever's leading the company, and really have some conversation about that. And I think what's most important is that whatever the agreement is around values, the executive team, that is the holy grail for them. And they always behave that way, and they always do things that are in alignment with that. So, for example, they don't, agree on and decide on values and then have an executive meeting where those values, things come up and violated. Exactly. Yeah. And so, it can be anything they want, but it has to be modeled by the executive team. And then from there, then from there, it gets rolled down throughout the entire organization. And then I like for there to be some things set up that actually boost those values. For example, perhaps you set up awards, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do that create culture within a company. So maybe one of the values is doing the right thing no matter what, or something like that, right? So whenever people in the organization do that, maybe there's a award that then backs up that really is a value, just as an example. But I think the major thing is that the executive team and the leadership team can never violate those values. And if they do, then they're truly not values of the organization.
Right. And it's almost as though an external coach has to arrive at that point. It's almost a coach, an HR individual, depending upon the size and scope of the organization, to identify where the breakdown is,
right,
and support the reconciliation of values and behaviors at that point. Doesn't mean that they can't renegotiate values at that stage.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you've hit on a really great point, which is that values really should be living and changing along with the different needs of the organization.
And it reminds me of Facebook and its mission statement, its evolution. From being the small firm at Harvard to now where they are today, the mission statements have evolved as well to one where they think globally rather than, okay, we got to make some money somehow.
Absolutely.
So in looking, we've kind of dealt with the founder phase, and we quickly went to the situation where there are employees and dealing with disconnects on values expressions. And we kind of missed some steps in the middle between the two. And it was a natural flow to our conversation, but I just want to make sure we cover a few points. So when you're now interviewing for people and you're trying to communicate values and interview for those values, knowing that everyone's on good behavior, how do you make sure that you are actually getting a hire that's going to adhere to those values, believe that those values are important, et cetera, as well as the skills, of course?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And you are, I'm sure, an expert at interviewing. But the way that I like to, the way that I think you can best attempt to address that is through behavioral-based interviewing. So, maybe you ask questions around values and times when employees previously have exemplified different values and things like that. Another way, depending on the level of the hire, that a lot of organizations are doing it now is through my sister just interviewed with a very large company for the head of HR last week, and they put her through basically a 2-hour presentation to the executive team that she had prepared in advance. And I think that those kinds of things where I see a lot of organizations actually attempting to sort of put the potential employee in the job for a day or for an activity or something like that does give you, or has the potential to give you, a good idea of how they would actually behave and perform in the job.
After all, when your sister is performing at the whiteboard or doing a presentation
Exactly.
to the executive team, they have a sense of bearing and style and thought process from this.
Yeah, it's hard to fake 2 hours of who you really are in that way.
I know a few people who can do it, but that's a different conversation. Having worked in search, you discover how psycho some people can be, and you learn little tricks to pull it out. But I digress again. So behavioral interviews, like tell me about a time when you fill in the blank.
Right.
And,
No, the key is to get the questions right, though, and to understand what it is you're actually going after by asking those questions.
right. And could you give me a sense of a value and the question that might align with it?
I would say so. Let's say that one of the values of the organization is always speak the truth, even if it isn't popular. Something along those lines. So what I would say is maybe tell me about a time when you were working on a project or going down a path with one ideal outcome, but perhaps maybe something happened during that project, or you were able to reveal additional information that found that you were on the wrong path. Can you explain, has anything like that ever happened? And can you explain a time, and what did you do?
And how you resolved it, perhaps.
That's right. Because what you're trying to figure out is, did they, A, realize they were on the wrong path, and then B, tell someone about it, even if it would have been, unpopular and maybe put the team behind in a deadline or something like that.
And one of the things I tend to look for when I was evaluating people that way was I would look for behavioral characteristics of someone who might not just simply recite a bunch of facts, but I would notice the body language to see whether or not they were pained in telling the story.
Right.
Are you uncomfortable talking about this incident? Because in effect, there's a confrontation going on.
That's right. Because what you're uncovering there really is emotional intelligence as well.
Right. And to me, that's the deeper one on that one.
Right. Right. It's analysis and emotional intelligence.
All at the same time, in a very simple little wrapper that a lot of people will fail at, as you know.
That's right.
So we're starting to look at bringing people on board. They're obviously going through the interviews, and now they're coming on board. And there's starting to be the chaos of multiple hires and synthesizing them into the firm, preserving values, while at the same time, do my job.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I see companies really, I have to say, regardless of the size, there are very few companies that I've seen that do a really good job with onboarding. And to me, what onboarding means is it's a combination of nuts and bolts, so telling people when and how they get paid and where the bathroom is. But more importantly, it's really giving them a great preview about what it means to be an employee of this company. And a lot of times, onboarding is sort of an afterthought. And what we know is that poor onboarding leads to poor employee engagement. And then obviously turnover and all of those things. So I like to really, really encourage companies to be very thoughtful about what they want an employee's first 2 weeks to be, as an example.
How about the pre-boarding phase? I love that word. I just saw it for the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
How about the pre-boarding phase as well, which I have to assume.
Equally poor. And equally important. So I have a very good friend who has been given a verbal offer for a large global organization at the SVP level and has been waiting for a month to see an offer letter. Well, he has a whole family that's dependent on relocating potentially, or, this is a big deal. And so, his experience now with this company is that, I don't know, is this how the organization runs? Is the lack of organization, indicative of how it will be to work there? So I think it is very important.
Yeah, and folks, if you're at this point where you're building culture, part of this is the messages that you convey to people about how you operate once the romance is over. So
That's right.
Once the initial wooing is done, do you treat the other person as the tired old husband or the taken for granted spouse in some way, and wind up in a situation where you alienate the person at the time that the honeymoon should exist?
That's right. And the message that you're sending, you have to keep in mind, once a hiring manager has sort of checked that box and decided who they're going to hire, then it's kind of off of their plate. But a lot of the times the hiring manager will say, okay, you should get your offer letter within 2 days or something like that. You have to remember that the candidate is on pins and needles this whole time. This is one of the most stressful life experiences that humans can go through. Leaving a job, changing a job, getting a new job. And so we really need to be empathetic toward the experience of that person.
And I understand if you're a hiring manager, if you're on the business side rather than the job hunter side, your tendency is to go, hey, it's no big deal. We're half a day late. So what? Well, they don't know that.
That's right.
They don't know it's going to be a half a day. For all they know, it's going to be a month because they heard stories from friends of theirs about bad experience that they've had, who are all now whispering in their ear about, this could be a problem.
That's right. And just set appropriate expectations.
Easier sometimes said than done with some firms.
Trust me, yes. I know I've worked for companies where offer letters have to be signed off by every single board member. And, I understand the difficulty and the intricacies. However, I think it's just about setting the appropriate expectations and following through.
Or communicating what the delay is and reset the expectation about when the step is coming.
That's right.
So we're starting to bring employees on, and now we're having the chaos of the new employees. They're on board, they're bumping heads with one another. Supervision sometimes is non-existent, lax, however someone wants to define it. How do you preserve culture as the culture is or the environment is expanding, and there tends not to be the enforcement of culture or the oversight to culture that is ideal?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a number of things. I think that if you have good leadership, particularly in the people space, you need to be able to grow at a pace that's appropriate for your organization. So I think that's number one. I think you really need to plan and be thoughtful about your growth and realistic about how quickly you can grow. But number two is, I think that, again, it comes back to the onboarding. And when I say onboarding, I don't necessarily just mean the first 2 weeks. I mean, what does the first 6 months look like? And how can you test for this employee has been appropriately onboarded? They understand what's expected of them. They understand what it means to work in this company and what the culture is. So I think that really the most important job that you have as a manager is that frequent check-in and touch point with those new employees. And that can be done in a variety of ways. It doesn't solely dependent on the manager. I've seen lots of good programs where there's a partnership between an existing employee who's sort of a cheerleader for the organization and helping to get that new employee acclimated. It can be in the form of, lots of work is done in teams these days. So I think that even each team has its own culture, subculture within an organization. Some teams have, some little award that floats around from person to person, or some teams every Thursday night, go bowling and have a beer or whatever it is. But I think it's also that you can really rely on the team to help to integrate that new employee as well.
And it's interesting you mentioned the after hours stuff. When does that get communicated to people?
Well, I come from technology, so it's almost all after hours. But what do you mean does it get communicated?
Because sometimes, I'm an East Coast guy, and a lot of my work was New York based, and people discovered after the fact what was expected of them in terms of after hours behaviors. The team goes out on Thursday night, and
and I think that all of that, I think you're kind of touching on a bit of a different subject, which is, do you have to participate in those kinds of things in order to really be integrated into the culture? So that may be a little bit of a different question, but I think that it's really important from the very beginning, when you first come on site and you're interviewing for an organization, that you understand, and I would ask as a candidate, what are some things that you do for socialization? What are, do if that's something that's important to you, right? Or, how does the group have fun? How do you, what kinds of hours do people keep? Do people social, you need to be asking those kinds of questions, particularly if they're important to you.
Agreed. And for so many folks, I'll go to the classic scenario of a team of single individuals, the new employee with the young child at home, male or female makes no difference. It's just about there's a desire to spend time at home with the young child, and how do you balance
That's
that?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're starting to bring people on board, and I keep thinking back to creating the culture. And so far, we've spoken earlier on about in effect, the whiteboarding and observation phase, and dealing with the incongruence between what's expressed and what's actually done. What other things go into creating the culture within the startup or an existing firm, for that matter?
Well, I think once you've defined what the culture is and what you seek for it to be, I think, I'm a big fan of incorporating it and making it a living, breathing thing. So some examples of what that might look like are actual physical reminders of the values. So posters and things posted around. Whenever there's an all hands meeting or quarterly business review, maybe the beginning is a review of the values and maybe some of the highlights that have happened that are in alignment with those values, and really having a lot of reminders about what they are. Maybe every meeting in the company needs to start with a minute about values and ways that we really did a great job, and ways maybe that there's room for improvement. But I think that it's just about, it's not about putting it in some binder on your shelf. It's about bringing it out and having it be present and constantly revisit it. I mean, companies that I work with, I actually, at the executive level, I actually encourage them to revisit the values quarterly. Say, are these still really relevant to us? Do they still make sense? Do they need to be updated? Do they feel stale?
Sweet. And in doing that, what sort of transitions have you seen people go from in definition of values? From, I'll use the example of one extreme to another, but they tend to be more textured, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time, for example, I'm working with a very large company now, and because the product has changed, so have the values. So, for example, the product was focused a lot on smaller business use, and it transitioned to more of an enterprise product. So along with those things, so as an example, and I'm not, using a specific company, but as an example, if you're focused on a smaller company, maybe some of your values are more about, person-to-person connection or relationship building one-on-one. Well, as you focus to becoming an enterprise solution, maybe your values change to, building the product that, dominates the market and is the, most efficient, productive, whatever. I mean, those are just kind of some examples, but sometimes the culture is led by the product or the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. What haven't I asked you about so far that we really should cover?
I think, one of the things that is interesting, and I think that founders really should think a lot about, I have a phrase that says, by the time you think that you might have a problem with your culture, you probably have a really big problem with your culture. And so I think that just what I would say to founders is it really is one of those things that once the horse is out of the barn, it is very, very difficult to bring it back without a lot of pain and perhaps lawsuits, depending on the size of the company and those kinds of things. So I think that it's just, I would, if I had a magic wand, I would tell every founder, be aware of it from the beginning and focus on it. And as soon as you're able to actually put some budget behind it, I think that $1 spent in the initial stages of developing your company will be very well spent.
After all, we've all heard of examples in recent years of firms whose cultures went out of control.
That's right.
I'm very confident that no one intentionally set that out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the biggest example, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the biggest example that comes to mind really is Uber. We all know what a successful company, what a successful product, what a brilliant strategy they had the marketplace dominated, but something like culture that nobody had their eye on. It got out of control, and it took a lot of resources and people like me getting involved to correct it. And, once there's blood in the water, people go after that. And now it's, whenever we hear Uber, a lot of us probably think about those problems as well, instead of it's just the best ride sharing app on the planet.
Right. And it came close to destroying the firm, obviously.
Yes, it did.
So, Jennifer, how can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Well, a number of ways. Probably the easiest is my website, which is jenniferpeatman.com. I have a very large Instagram following as well, which is at Jennifer Peatman Coaching. And I'm very, very proud of my private Facebook group, which is invitation only. So you could, go to my website, send me an email, and I would love to hear from you.
And would you spell Jennifer
Sure.
Peatman for us?
Sure. It's JenniferPeatman.
Terrific. So that's today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen to the show. Just subscribe so you get downloads whenever I release a new episode. Each show is going to be bite-sized morsels of advice just like today's. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do hope you subscribe. And if you do choose to subscribe, I hope you decide to support the show. There's a link that will take you to anchor.fm where you can make a pledge in support of the show. I'd greatly appreciate it. If you're interested in my coaching you, connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/IN/the Big Game Hunter. Mention that you listen to the show. I just happen to like knowing I'm helping some folks. And once we're connected, message me about your interest in coaching. We'll set up a free call. We'll get acquainted, see if it makes sense. I'll be back soon with more. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great day. Take care. Time for to find it.